Hey folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. Today, I have the illustrious Darrius on the show again. Darrius, how's it going?
Yeah, doing great.
And we did not coordinate ahead of time, but we're both wearing red shirts. Darrius is wearing the Know Your Tools Secure IT 360 Offensive Security t-shirt that I made for everybody last year for Christmas. And I'm wearing my Red Siege I Am Offensive shirt, which is one of my favorites as well. But we're coordinated in red today, and I guess that suits the topic, right, Darrius? Because in this episode,
yeah, I think we both had the same exact kind of mindset going forward today.
Yep. So Darrius and I, we're like brainstorming topics and stuff earlier in the week, and it's like, well, let's do an offensive TTPs and like tools type of episode, right? And so when we woke up this morning, we must have been on the same brainwave, like, oh, we're doing like an offensive TTPs tooling type episode today. So let's wear red. So this episode, we're going to be talking about offensive TTPs, tools, things that we think are exciting or that are trending or just new things that we've seen out there in the world that could be abused and used for nefarious deeds. Little hint to later in the episode, even stuff that's like a ID or a kind of an IDE or a code editor, that we've seen in the news just recently that, has some port forwarding features to it. So that looks promising as well. But that's what this episode is all about, just kind of offensive tooling, TTPs that we're looking forward to, excited about, or, things that we see that are trending in the offensive world. Both in offensive testing and, attacker activity. So, without further ado, Darrius, maybe open it up and let's just talk about briefly, let's talk about what we think in terms of this episode, right? Like you wanted to put this episode together, like offensive tooling, TTPs. What do you think you're going for this episode? And, let's get into some of the topics.
Yeah, so I think for me, when I think of TTPs, one, I want it to be something I find interesting first and foremost. May not be interesting to all, but if it's cool to me, I definitely tend to do my research and dive 100% in on it. But I think also, feasibility and practicality, I think is huge. I don't know about you, but one thing that I often see when I'm working on engagements is like I may find something and then I'll go online, do a little bit of research, and I find something that's really cool, but it's just not feasible or practical to actually implement or execute within the confines of the engagement. And so I end up having to put it on the back burner. So I think that's something that's critical to me in terms of TTPs. And so, I think that's really kind of my main criteria as I was kind of putting things together was, do I find it cool? And also, could I see myself doing this?
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. So I'm going to start out with the first one, and then I'll let you take the second one. Maybe we just go back and forth and just kind of hop through our list of stuff, as it makes sense. So one thing in Darrius, you've mentioned this before too, a lot of tooling is moving to other languages, right? We're seeing a lot of languages written in Go, or a lot of offensive security tools and, exploits, and actual threat actor malware being written in different languages now. A couple of the popular ones that come to my mind is Nim, Rust, and Golang. We're seeing this more and more. These languages, it can be a little bit more complex to use, and maybe there's a little bit more of a learning curve with them. Although some languages like Nim, I think is kind of similar to other languages in its syntax, but I think part of the motivation, right, is some of these languages are harder to disassemble. There's better cross-platform capabilities with them, especially with like Go. It's harder to kind of disassemble and figure out what's going on with some of these if you write them in those languages after they're compiled, and you can kind of wrap older payloads or older tooling in these new languages. So one example that I've seen is using a packer, right, is called, you essentially wrap your tooling in another language and use some of the features of that language to compile it. to that language. So there's packers written in Go, there's packers written in Nim and Rust, and essentially you can just wrap up another tool that's written in a different language, and now it's a little bit harder to detect the behavior of that tool. It's harder to signature it and things like that. And then also, just evading signature detection. So, Darius, thoughts on using alternative languages, that is not C, C++, C sharp, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I think yes, 100% agree that you're seeing a lot of this first and foremost. I think one of the other additional benefits that I kind of think of is traditionally one of the first languages that people kind of start out with is, oh, I'm going to learn Python because it's universal, and Python is great. But the thing about Python is it's a jack of all trades, master of none. And so I know one of the things that I kind of constantly see is you see a lot of retooling of common Python tools into Go. And one of the biggest reasons why is because Go is just faster. A common example I kind of think of is like MassScan, right? Like MassScan is written in Go. It's an Mmap alternative. And so you're going to get your results a lot faster with MassScan versus Nmap. And so it then becomes kind of this workflow where you can combine the combine the tools. So you may run MassScan first to just, okay, like what's live, what's running, what services are running, and then you can use Nmap for more granular, like, okay, now let's run scripts and things of that nature. So I think that's another reason why we're seeing a lot of Go. To your point, I think Nim. I am personally a huge fan of Nim. I want to learn a little bit more about it. I think kind of to your point, it's going to evade most AV and EDR tools currently, and so I think if anybody's out there that's looking for kind of that easy win or trying to get their name out there, I think one of the best things you can do right now is probably rewrite popular toolings into one of these new languages.
Yeah, for sure. And Nim, Rust, Go, they have quite a bit of library support for working with like Windows internals or working with different features or things that you're trying to do. So that's a really added benefit to those too. So, Darius, your turn. What's exciting, unique, interesting, trending for you?
So one thing that I'm kind of a fan of, and that we're kind of seeing is we're seeing more unique C2s, and this isn't like brand new, as in within this past month. It's been happening over the past couple of years, but a few that I find interesting is like I remember reading last year, someone created a C2 using GitHub, and they were just passing commands and data through GitHub, and that's just crazy to me because I think from a defensive perspective, one, how do you stop that, right? Especially if you have an in-house development team who uses GitHub for their stuff. What are you going to do? Block it? So it just becomes a lot harder to detect. And then another one, you kind of hinted at it earlier, is with VS Code. There's a lot coming out with VS Code now. So it is modular and extensible, which is great from a developer standpoint because now I can add extensions to make my life easier. But from a red team offensive perspective, it just leads. There's so much you can do. So there's Mythic C2, which is basically an extension, a VS Code extension that operates and works as a C2. So if you can get VS Code on a box and get that extension on the box, you effectively have a C2. And it's going to be relatively hard to detect. So that's kind of something that I personally find really interesting. That I think you're seeing a trend of. We're moving away from your traditional. Everyone is using. You see Cobalt Strike all the time,
Yep.
and so now we're just seeing other C2s. And I'm sure you probably have a lot of thoughts on this since you took your CRTO. So I know they probably tackled that topic a lot as well.
Yeah, and the RTO course is built around Cobalt Strike, and it kind of is the introductory course into using Cobalt Strike and red teaming. So it was pretty significant. I know in previous years, Ross and Mouse had tried to use Covenant, I think, in the course. So there was some variability with that, but now it is Cobalt Strike. But yeah, to your point, almost everything that's a cloud service now can be used as a C2. So it's really interesting to see how attackers and red teamers alike are kind of adapting to the new world uh, which is not necessarily new, like you said, of cloud services, using what is already legitimate traffic in the environment and piggybacking off that for C2. So it's quite an interesting trend. That kind of ties into my next point is using legitimate remote access tools. So this is something that I think most pen testers, red teamers, maybe use to some extent in their engagements. Legit remote access tools. Maybe that's something that red teamers who are listening have used or abused in the past, or maybe this is something that you even use yourself as an IT admin, right? Stuff like TeamViewer or AnyDesk, Atera, the typical remote access, remote support tools. Those are being, more, and we're seeing that being used more and more by threat actors to maintain persistence to environments and just to use the features of those tools. You can, with those tools, you can get a system shell instantly because that's how it gets installed. You can transfer files. You can do a lot of different and unique stuff with it, and it looks like a legitimate software, right? It's just AnyDesk, client running on the endpoint. So that is something that I think is interesting, that I think is a trend that will continue, and something that all organizations should be prepared for and should be working to block those programs in your environment, block the the cloud resources for those at your firewall and things like that, and that's a way you can kind of help mitigate some of that stuff.
It's kind of interesting because it's not only just remote access tools. I also think in terms of like data exfiltration, right? Where oh, I'm just going to use Dropbox or Google Drive or
Sure.
anything like that. And so I know we're thinking from a red team perspective, but to kind of shift focus to the defenders out there, man, I think it's at the point now where you really need to inventory what do we use in our company, like officially have a standard, have a policy, and just say like, if you decide, hey, we use Dropbox and TeamViewer, then like, okay, cool, you can expect that in your environment. But then, like you said, lock it down so that all the other common stuff out there um, just isn't
Yep.
able to work in your environment. And that's something. It really just comes down to application control. Um,
Mhm.
and that's a tough thing. It's a thing that would fix a lot of issues and problems
Yep.
in most environments. But and I don't know about you, but from what I've seen, most companies still aren't doing that. Um,
Yeah, if Brad were on the podcast, he would say it's the blocking and tackling, right? It's inventory,
yeah,
inventory management, inventorying your software, but also baselining, like figuring out what is normal and what is expected in your environment, right? If you're using TeamViewer, are you expecting it on an accounting PC? Maybe, maybe not. So it's inventory and it's baselining and like you said, controlling what applications are allowed in the environment.
and I also look at it in terms of I just think those who have MSPs and are outsourcing some of these monitoring services, are the people monitoring your environment, do they even know what tools do you use? Do they know that you don't use Dropbox? And if so, are they prepared to detect and alert you about it? These are kind of the things that I kind of think about if
Yeah.
I were a defender.
Yeah, as a defender, I'm terrified of some MSP or vendor or third party having remote access into my environment whenever they want. Like that just scares the daylights out of me. So the more you can restrict that and mitigate it and control it and identify it, I think the better off you'll be.
So the next one I had mainly deals with okay, you've been doing your work, you fish somebody, you have somewhat initial access, you have creds, and this is specifically in terms of Microsoft. Is the use of APIs versus using the or GUI console for things. So in the past, it used to be okay, you fish someone, now you have access to their email, and now you're manually combing through their email and things of that nature. And what I think we're seeing now, we're seeing more of is a shift towards okay, I have access. I have a session. I have a session key. I have an access key. And now, instead of manually going through the GUI and digging for things, I'm going to load up Microsoft Graph. I'm going to take that key, and then from there, that's where I'm going to do further enumeration and digging and things of that nature. Just because Microsoft Graph, one, there's at this point there's an API for almost anything that you're looking to do. But two, from a logging perspective, Graph is somewhat limited. I get this question a lot from clients where they're like, "Hey, how do I monitor Microsoft Graph usage?" And the current answer is, well, you kind of can't. At least not specifically graph usage. It's, if I make a request in Graph to do something in Outlook, then you have to go look at the Outlook logs, but it's not going to explicitly say, "Hey, this came from Microsoft Graph presently." Um, and so I think this particular TTP here, I think is huge in terms of invading detection, and it just has a lot of potential. It's also extremely
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's extremely relevant because of the news about Microsoft's MSA key, right? This the signing key.
mm-hmm.
The initial access for that is still unknown or is speculative. I believe at the time of this episode, and it's possible that a threat actor got access to a session token, just like you were describing, and then was able to get access to the environment somehow. But the session stealing, like the browser in the middle type attacks, and those kinds of things, can be a way to bypass conditional access. It can bypass MFA and things like that. So yeah, that can be a tricky one. It could be hard for defenders if you're not prepared for it. So that kind of leads really well into the next one. In some ways, maybe it doesn't. You decide. But proxying tools into the environment versus running them on the host. So, we've seen this trend, and if you've been in security for a little while, you've heard the phrase "living off the land," right? And back when PowerShell was really popular, when PowerView and the PowerSploit framework came out, and Empire was popular, there was a lot of talk about living off the land, right? And using PowerShell and MS Build and things like that. And while those are still used today and very effective in some manners, we are begun to see over the last couple of years now, attackers are starting to move off the endpoint and proxy their tools in the environment. So now they're not just running things directly on the host; they have an implant, and they're running the evil stuff. They're tooling on their host machine and proxying that traffic in. So all of those identifiers really are not there that would typically be there. And so that's something I see as a trend, and kind of something that is something I'm taking to heart in our testing, our internal testing, is trying to work like an attacker would work, right? Proxying their traffic through and doing it that way. And what we find is just a lot of those endpoint-based detections are not viable anymore, right? You have to start looking at the identity and the network traffic, right? And that's becoming more important. So that's why we're seeing, Defender for Identity, and CrowdStrike has their own identity product, and SentinelOne, and all these companies have these identity products now because they know that attacks are not just on the endpoints anymore. So that's something that's been an interesting trend to me, and something that as somebody who does offensive testing, especially internal testing, something I'm looking forward to using more, to kind of get a sense of how attackers are doing it, to better help defenders defend against that kind of thing.
Nice. So keeping in line with, I think it's very topical. In fact, we talked about it, I think it would have been the last podcast, in terms of, you're bringing in these vendors and software into your environment, and you're kind of at the mercy of how they developed it. This one, to me, I'm going to get a little bit specific here. It's a Patch My PC. So this one I like because at a previous place of employment, we used Patch My PC. For those who don't know, it's exactly what it sounds like. You can use it to keep software and things of that nature up to date. And a lot of times it has very privileged access in order to be able to do things. And so I'm going to mispronounce their name. I think it's Lumosec. They actually have released a tool which allows you to decrypt the password strings within the settings file. And I think, the thing that's really interesting to me, and like I said, it ties back into our previous podcast, is the fact that the software developers, one, the reason why this works is because they have lax ACLs. Any and everyone has access to the directory where this settings.xml lives, and can pretty much do whatever they want to in that directory. Why? Because that's just how the developers decided to do it in order to make things work. Uh, and then two, they're saving the crypto functions in registry. So, with the combination of those things, if you're a red teamer, pen tester, if you are in an environment that uses patch my PC, you can essentially go and grab all the secrets out of that settings file. And I think that's huge, and relatively easy and practical.
Yeah, and I asked him on Twitter. I said, "Is there an ACL on that registry entry for those?" And it's like, no, it's just world readable. Everybody on the PC can read it, so it's not even restricted to administrators to see it, which is kind of a bummer to me, and something that the vendor should address for sure, because that could be a pretty big gap in your environment if those those accounts are highly privileged.
I would be shocked if we didn't see an update from them relatively soon.
Yeah. It's interesting. I haven't, on all the pen tests we've done the last couple of years, I haven't seen Patch My PC. So that's interesting. Maybe I will run into it as some sort of like manifestation of this podcast, right? Like I'll see it on the next pen test and I can tell the client and they can maybe fix it or something. Or maybe there'll be a patch for it by then and be like, yeah, there was this thing and they fixed it. And I talked about it on this podcast, but I don't know, maybe.
Hey, you said it. Look, we'll see. It's going to happen now. Just your luck.
Yeah, I'm really trying to manifest it right now. So the last one for me is using, and this is another trend thing, but using appliances and IoT devices, edge devices, firewalls, and things like that as the foothold, right? Instead of using like a traditional Windows PC or even Linux or something like that, something where there would be EDR on it and be heavily monitored. We're seeing attackers use firewalls and routers and IoT devices and appliances, right? Think VMware and think, like a manage engine appliance type things and firewalls. We're seeing, that being used quite heavily now as their foothold. And, there's no EDR on your firewall, right? And, there's really not much in the way of protecting those from, misuse or kind of bad stuff happening, right? Firmware, uploading malicious firmware and kind of modifying that device. So that's something I'm seeing is interesting, something to think about of how we protect these devices. How we analyze the firmware on them. How do we know if settings have been changed? How do we know when something bad happens to those devices? So that's something I think is a hard thing for defenders to tackle, but I think it's something that's important, and I think it's something that we'll definitely see more of.
I can agree with that, and it's kind of interesting. It's interesting because to your point, it seems like the solution, the recommended solution, most of the time is just isolate your IoT devices on their own network, and then you're fine. But to your point, that's probably not the end all be all solution. And then additionally, there's still the idea of detections, and so that can get really complicated.
Yeah, and if it's like a firewall, like how do you isolate the firewall? The firewall is the thing doing the isolation many times, and like you can have DMZs and you can have multiple firewalls, and you can get pretty wild with your network configuration, I'm sure, but it's still kind of a difficult thing to tackle right now until we start seeing more vendors kind of look at the security of those devices and how they can kind of prevent misuse and abuse of those. That's something we'll definitely see, probably more from the more advanced state actors, state sponsored actors kind of thing. But, I wouldn't be surprised if it starts being more commercialized as people start looking at it more and start kind of weaponizing tooling for it and things like that.
Well, so the last one for me, and once again, we're going to talk about it again, is VS Code. So this isn't even an extension. This is just a native feature. Is you can now do forwarding natively through VS Code. And man, I'm kind of on the fence because as a developer,
I think you said fort porting.
Oh, I'm sorry, port forwarding.
That'll be a funny blooper for the podcast for everybody.
It's a
But
new
for anybody listening who's dyslexic, they probably heard it the right way. So
new TTP Fort porting, whatever I said. But yeah, VS Code, you can do port forwarding natively in VS Code. And I'm on the fence because as a developer, I can somewhat see the benefit of being able to do that. I'm quickly testing. I need to, expose something that I'm doing locally, just temporarily to do what I need to do. Um, but I think the applications from an offensive security perspective are endless. I mean, how many hack the box or try hack me challenges is one of the main things you're going to do is, okay, get on the box, port forward. Now you have a reverse shell. And so the fact that that's kind of built in, I think we'll probably see an increase of that, or I expect red teamers to use it a little bit more. Um, and that just becomes difficult to handle because what are you gonna do? You're gonna block, or you're gonna block VS Code? Are you gonna at the at your firewall? I can't remember exactly what you need to block. It escapes me at the moment, but I mean, are you going to block that? And if so, now that might be a battle with your dev team. So that right there, I think, is an interesting choice that it has that ability. But I'm excited to see where it goes.
yeah, and I saw on Twitter that there are several domains, like random domains that are associated with that, and they kind of, I think they rotate. Somebody said they on Twitter that they rotate every time you use it or you spin up a new port forwarding session or a new tunnel, something like that. So that can add complications for both attackers and defenders, right? If you're an attacker using a C2, you need to account for that somehow. As a defender, maybe it's a little bit more difficult to block all those domains potentially, but yeah, that's interesting to me, and it's a curious development. You know, I haven't looked at it in any extreme depth, so I don't know what security features are built in, if any, to kind of prevent abuse. But you would have to think that developers would be thinking about it, right? And when you're developing stuff like this, and you're like, oh, let's do some port forwarding and let's have these tunnel things. You know, I'd be curious to be a fly in the wall in those discussions, right? Like, is there any discussion at all, like, about, abuse of these features and that kind of thing, or are they developing them with that in mind, right? Like knowing that there could be abuse with it. And I guess it's a double-edged sword because, Darrius, everything can be abused, right? Like, there's not a single thing probably in the world that you could develop or create or have that can't be used in a malicious way or abused. So I guess that's just part of it, but just kind of an interesting thing from a developer standpoint.
Agreed.
Cool. So anything else? Any other tools, TTPs, or anything interesting, trending, spicy you want to talk about?
I literally just thought of it just because we're talking about VS Code and we're talking about Microsoft. I won't go too much into it, but I think it's interesting that they're introducing Python to Excel.
Yeah, how did we miss that? I mean, that's a pretty big one.
And like, granted, from my understanding, there's nothing. I don't even know if it's been released yet. And I remember reading the article on it, and it seems like they've put some good controls in place. But man, I would not be shocked if a year from now there's something out there where it's like, it just kind of seems like a given. You're adding Python to Excel. So
yeah, I think you're being generous with the timeline. I think before the end of the year, somebody's going to find some way to kind of like escape the sandbox that it's in or abuse it in some way. Like, I think somebody will come up with something pretty quickly. But yeah, I don't know how we missed that because that was pretty big news.
Yeah.
And pretty significant thing. I guess part of it is I am primarily internal assume breach pen test. That's primarily internal network pen testing, assume breach. Kind of my jam. I don't do initial access type of engagements, not a lot of social engineering and that kind of thing. So I'm kind of like in my own little like specialized little area, and I see this stuff, but like I don't get a chance to play with the initial access type stuff because I'm kind of in my lane working on tooling and TTPs for that. So that would probably escape my mind for that reason, but I'm just making excuses now. So,
it's kind of, to your point, it's going to be cool. I can see there being the attack chain of, I mean, there's the whole Teams thing where you can message people that aren't, even if you're not in their organization, you can message and send them stuff. And so I can see there being a chain of, Excel file Python, that has some Python code. And even though it doesn't run locally on the machine, I know they said that, but hey, you send it off to someone
Yep.
and then they open it and it runs and does whatever,
Sure.
I could see that attack chain potentially,
Yep.
materializing. So we'll
Yeah.
see.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. And the last thing I'll say is that's like trending from an offensive like spicy TTP perspective is core dumps. So protect those core dumps.
Yeah.
System crash logs, audit logs from system crashes and stuff like that, because that's an up and coming TTP to look out for.
That is very topical literally as of today of recording. Microsoft is learning that, or has learned that lesson. So,
yep. Very interesting. So, that's all we have for you today. If you enjoyed this episode, if it was entertaining or you got value from it, best thing you can do for us to kind of help, if you feel so inclined, is to share it with your peers, share it with your network, share it on social media if you like this episode. And of course, liking it on YouTube or like Spotify, I think it's called favoriting, or subscribing, that kind of thing can kind of help us reach more viewers or listeners, depending where you are, and spread the good word. So if you enjoyed this episode, consider that. You can check us out at offsec.blog and at securit360.com. And we'll see everybody next Wednesday.
See you, everyone.